ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين. أما بعد، فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله وعلى آلك وأصحابك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Sayyiduna Uthman radiallahu ta'ala an, he was an individual whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed with some amazing qualities. One of the qualities which Sayyiduna Uthman was known for was his modesty, his haya. He was a person who was extremely shy, extremely bashful, which was also a quality of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they mentioned in regards to him that if he was to ever take ghusl, even if he was surrounded by four walls and a locked door, his haya, his shamefulness in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not allow him to stand up straight. Rather, he would bend so much that his chest would touch his knees. This is how much haya he would have behind closed doors. And today we see our youngsters that when they go out, the clothing which they are wearing, it's highly inappropriate. Not just amongst the females, even amongst the males, right? Wearing shorts and exposing the aura and these types of things. But the reality is, Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, he had such a beautiful disposition that what happened on one occasion, aapko malum hai कि Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was within his home and he was sat in a relaxed manner. And Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq came and the Prophet stayed as he was. Sayyidina Umar came, he stayed as he was. But when Sayyidina Uthman knocked at the door, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked him to wait. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he sat up. His shin which was exposed, he covered. He made sure everything was proper. And then he received Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala. Just think for a second, jab maqam dekha jata hai. When you look at station, Sayyidina Abu Bakr has high station. Sayyidina Umar has high station. But why is the Prophet ﷺ receiving Sayyidina Uthman in this way? And just to make you understand, if some royalty arrived today, think about how if you were at work, somebody comes of a high position, you straighten your tie, you make sure your shirt is tucked in, you make sure your clothes are proper. Yeah? And this is how the Prophet ﷺ is receiving a man like Sayyidina Uthman. And when Sayyidina Aisha Siddiqa, she says, Ya Rasulullah, when my father came, you stayed as you were. When Sayyidina Umar came, you stayed as you were. But when Uthman comes, all of a sudden your situation, it changes. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, should I not have haya in front of that individual whom the angels have haya? Look, normally what happens is that the angels inspire us to be good. But here the angels have a specific way of behaving in front of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala. In one narration it mentions, Sayyidina Uthman, once his qamis, it was open. A bit of his chest was exposed. And the Prophet ﷺ said, the angels are refusing to enter until you don't cover. And even they were mindful of Sayyidina Uthman to this extent. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, he was a man who used to really fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Once, whenever he would go to the graveyard after janazah, they say he would cry until his beard would become wet with tears. This is how much he would cry. And the people would say, jab Jahannam ka tazkira hota hai, jab Qayamat ka tazkira hota hai, when the day of judgment is mentioned, when hellfire is mentioned, you don't cry like this. But when the grave, you sit in front of the grave, you cry so much. And Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, and he said that this is the first stage. Ye wo pehla marhala hai. Agar hum isme kamyab hue, then everything else will go easy. Lekin agar hum isme, if we fail here, then everything else is finished. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, and there's so many facets of his life that we can look at. Whether we look at his modesty, his shame, whether we look at his taqwa. This was a man whose love of the Quran, we try to finish the Quran in Ramadan in 30 days. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala an, he would finish the Quran Kareem in one day. And he's from those few individuals who recited the entire Quran in one rakat, in one cycle, in one unit in front of the Kaaba. You will not find many individuals like this. But he had a very deep connection with the Quran, which we're going to talk about today, which led to the compilation of the Quran Kareem. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala an, throughout his entire life, he had this very close relationship with the Prophet ﷺ. As we mentioned, he was the son-in-law. He was one of the earliest adopters of Islam. When the Prophet ﷺ, he leaves this world, Sayyidina Uthman, it hit him very hard. And many a person, after this, they left from Madinatul Munawwarah. Many a person, they didn't say a single word after this. There were companions whom, after the Prophet ﷺ left from this world, due to the sadness which they felt, they themselves passed away. Sayyidina Uthman, he had, what a relationship he had once. They say he was doing wuzu. And as he was doing wuzu and he completed his wuzu, he began to smile. And they said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, why are you smiling? And he says that I am smiling because once the Prophet ﷺ was in the same place. He was performing wudu, and after he completed his wudu, he began to smile as well. So remembering the Prophet ﷺ smiling is making me smile. So they said, he said, Ya Rasulullah, why are you smiling? Sayyidina Uthman asked, why are you smiling? And the Prophet ﷺ said that when a worshipper, he does wuzu, and he washes his face, then the sins from his face, they come out. When he washes his arms, and the sins from his arms, they come out. When he does masa, then the sins from his head come out. And when the Prophet ﷺ, he was informed of this, he began to smile. When I saw the Prophet ﷺ smiling, so today now I am smiling as well. And this is how deep connection they had. Hum kya kehte hain? Hum kehte hain ki ye to sirf sunnat hai. This is what we say. We say it's only sunnat. And often at times when we say to somebody कि हमको ये काम करना चाहिए, तो क्या पूछते हैं कि इमाम साहब, is it farz? अगर मैंने नहीं किया तो क्या ये haram होगा? And as long as it's not farz, and as long as by missing it is not haram, the person thinks, chutkara is fine, no problem, we can leave it. Look at our situation and look at the situation of this man. And this is why, on one occasion, when your iman increases, your martaba increases. Sayyidina Uthman, he sat on the mimbar. A man walks into the majlis. What had happened? This man, he was walking on the street. His eye fell upon a woman. Eventually he moves his eyesight away, but the naqsh, the vision, it stays within him, and he's repeating that in his mind. This beauty of this woman, he's come into his heart. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, as this man comes in, he says that some of you come into the masjid and you have zina in your eyes. The man, he stood up, wo hayran ho gaya ki ye kya baat hai? He says, oh Uthman, is wahi coming upon you? Is revelation coming upon you? Are you a prophet of Allah? And Sayyidina Uthman says, the door of prophethood is closed. What's left is firasa, insight. اتقوا فراسة المؤمن فإنه ينظر بنور الله تعالى. Fear the insight of a believer, for he sees with the nur, with the light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Sayyidina Uthman, he could see the effect of the sin within the person. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, and even after the leaving of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he stayed in Madinatul Munawwarah. He supported the Khilafah. In the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq, he was one of his main advisors, one of the earliest people to pledge allegiance to him. And there's one beautiful narration which I can't pass without mentioning. Although it's not to do with his Khilafah, it's such a beautiful narration. When I read it, it made me really happy. कि Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala an के दौरे खिलाफत में there was a drought. There was no food, provision in Madinatul Munawwarah. और लोगों को ये खबर मिली कि Sayyidina Uthman का जो है एक कारवां, one caravan is coming for Sayyidina Uthman, business. And almost 1,000 camels inside this caravan. तो लोग वो पहुंच गए, कहा कि we want to get involved in this business. Whatever success we have, for every 1 dirham we make, we will give you 1 dirham. 100% profits. Sayyidina Uthman says no. He says, I've already been offered more than this. So they offer 2 dirhams. For every 1 dirham we make, we'll give you 2 dirhams. He says, no, I've been offered more than this. And in this way, they're offering him, they say up to the extent they get to 7 dirhams. For every 1 dirham we make, we will give you 7 dirhams. And we're going to give you 700 profit. We will take 1 dirham, we will give you 7. Sayyidina Uthman says, no. All of these people are in front of him. He's being given the opportunity of like a lifetime to make such a huge business, right? You know the law of scarcity. This is a time of drought. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, and he can make huge quantities of money. He's saying no to each and every single one of them. They go and complain to Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq. So Abu Bakr, look, he's not even participating in this. You know, he should be helping us in this. Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq says, no, have good opinion of this individual. He's not an average person. Let's go and speak to him. And when they go and speak to Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, and he says that, these people, they offered me 7 for every dirham, but there's a person who has offered me 700 in exchange. And who is that? That is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, "Oh Abu Bakr, you are witness, this entire caravan of 1,000 camels I have given in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala." And this was a very difficult time for Muslims, but look how he brings ease to them. And so he wasn't a man of the dunya, and it's very important that we understand this concept, because we're going to talk about some rumors tomorrow which were levied against Sayyidina Uthman, some rumors which people had against Sayyidina Uthman. And they are all false, there is no truth to them at all. In the time of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala and Sayyidina Uthman, he established the dawaween, the registers, census data which we have today. This was established by Sayyidina Uthman. He encouraged so that they would know how many people were in the Khilafah and how many individuals were given what quantity of money. So they could keep track of things, making sure that there was not a single individual who was being given more or someone was given less, like this. Now, in regards to him becoming the Khalifa, this was already foretold by the Prophet ﷺ. Because when a person approached, we mentioned this hadith previously, when a person approached the Prophet ﷺ and said, "Who should I give my zakat to?" He said, "If I'm not here, then give it to Abu Bakr Siddiq." He said, "What about if Abu Bakr is not there?" He said, "Give it to Sayyidina Umar." And what if Umar is not there? He said, "Then in that case, give it to Uthman, and may you be perished on that day when Uthman is killed." So the Prophet ﷺ, he's already mentioning the order, Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman. And he's also mentioning about Sayyidina Uthman being martyred. So what happened? Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala, and we mentioned about this, Abu Lu'lu'ah, the Persian slave, he stabbed Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala, and as he was preparing to lead the Fajr prayers. The people, they approach Sayyidina Umar, and they say that, "Oh Umar, appoint a Khalifa." And he says, "You don't leave me alone when I'm alive, and now that I'm dying, you don't leave me alone as well. And you just want me to solve all of your problems." And Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala, and he says that, "Look, I'm not going to select a Khalifa." He feared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If he chooses a Khalifa, whatever that Khalifa does, it all goes back to him. So he says, "I'm not going to choose a Khalifa." They said, "What about your son, Abdullah bin Umar? He's a perfect candidate. He's so knowledgeable. He spent a lot of time with the Prophet ﷺ." He says, "Not a chance." He goes, "It's enough for Banu Adi that there was one Khalifa. You need to have 2 Khalifas from the same tribe." He says, "Not a chance." He says, "This is what we're going to do. I will elect 6 individuals whom were from the Ashra Mubashara, the 10 promised Jannah. And from these 6 individuals, they can have a discussion, and within 3 days, somebody needs to be chosen." Who were those 6? Number 1, Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala an. Number 2, Sayyidina Ali. Number 3, Sayyidina Talha ibn Ubaidillah. Number 4, Sayyidina Zubair ibn al-Awwam. And number 5, Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Abi al-Waqas. And number 6 was Sayyidina Abdul Rahman ibn Auf radiallahu ta'ala an. From these 6 individuals, and Sayyidina Umar passes away, these 6 individuals, they get together. They need to select a Khalifa. Some of those individuals, under the instruction of Abdul Rahman, they say, "Look, we don't want to be Khalifa, so we will give our right to somebody else." So Sayyidina Talha gives his right to Sayyidina Uthman. Sayyidina Zubair gives his right to Sayyidina Ali. And Sayyidina Sa'd gives his right to Sayyidina Abdul Rahman. Who's left now? 3 people. Who are the 3 people? Sayyidina Uthman, Sayyidina Ali, and Sayyidina Abdul Rahman. Sayyidina Abdul Rahman says, "Look, I don't want to be Khalifa. However, if you give me the responsibility, I will select whom I believe to be the best and whom the people believe to be the best candidate for this position. If you two agree." Both of them, they're happy. Now, Sayyidina Abdul Rahman bin Auf, he starts to go around. Like he goes to Sayyidina Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and he says, "Who do you think should be the Khalifa?" He says, "I think Sayyidina Uthman is a good candidate." He goes to Sayyidina Zubair, he says, "I think Sayyidina Ali or Sayyidina Uthman. One of the two, they're both good candidates." And like this, he's going to the companions one by one and he's asking them, he's saying, "Who do you believe to be the most worthy of this position?" And once he gathers all of this information, he goes to Sayyidina Uthman and he says to Uthman, if I do not select you as the Khalifa, who would you choose? Look at the love of the companions. He says, if you don't choose me, it should be Ali. And when he goes to Sayyidina Ali says, if you don't choose me, it should be Uthman. And in this way, Sayyidina Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, he goes to Sayyidina Ali and he says, if I were to pledge allegiance to you in accordance with the Quran and Sunnah, and in accordance with the practice of Abu Bakr and Umar radiallahu ta'ala, would you accept? And Sayyidina Ali says, in whichever capacity I can. When he goes to Sayyidina Uthman and he says the same words, Sayyidina Uthman says yes. And from all of this information, Sayyidina Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, and based upon the consensus of the companions, because they gathered upon this, Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala is pledged allegiance to, and in this way 3 days after Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala he passed away, Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala he is elected the Khalifa. This is the 24th year, I believe, after Hijrah. Now something amazing happens. Previous people would go out and they would say pledge allegiance to the Khalifa. But when Sayyidina Uthman is elected the Khalifa, people are coming to Medina to Munawwara to pledge allegiance to him. Because remember we mentioned people loved Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala. He was a man of amazing character. People are coming with their delegations, with their leaders. They're coming just to pledge allegiance to Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala. Sayyidina Uthman, it's now time for him to deliver his first khutbah. And they say that at this time he was so overwhelmed, he was struggling to speak. What's beautiful about Sayyidina Uthman, which we should mention at this point as well, you know, in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there used to be 3 steps to the minbar. And the Prophet ﷺ would stand on the first step. When Sayyidina Abu Bakr became the Khalifa, he stood on the second step. And when Sayyidina Umar became the Khalifa, he stood on the third step. Now when it came to Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, the question is, where will he stand? The first step, the second step, the third step. Which one is he going to stand upon? And Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, he chose to stand on the first step. And when people, they asked him, because people would raise objections to everything, eventually, you know, they would just want an excuse to criticize him. And one of the criticisms they would have against Sayyidina Uthman is, they would say that you stood on the same step as the Prophet ﷺ. Sayyidina Uthman, he explained, he said, if I stood on the second step, people would think that I think I'm equal to Abu Bakr. And if I stood on the third step, people would think that I think I'm equal to Umar. Now if you say to me, where else am I going to stand? Am I going to start digging into the ground and making steps into the ground? There's only 3 steps. But I knew for a fact that if I stood on the first step, there would be no person on the face of this earth who would think that I think I'm equal to the Prophet ﷺ. Look at the intellect, look at the intelligence. So he says, I stood on the first step for this reason. You know, adding to this, hum jab Juma namaz padhte hai, there's 2 azans. You know who was the one who introduced these 2 azans? The second azan was Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala. Because the Madinah Munawwara had become very wide, they needed to introduce the first azan, so it gave people a chance to come to the masjid. Again, people criticized him for this. But today, 1400 years later, do we not practice these 2 azans? We do. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, he knew that if he did not do this, then people would be lazy. The first azan would happen. By the time they got to the masjid, the khutbah would be finished. So he introduced the first azan to give people a chance to come to the masjid. And Sayyidina Uthman, he would sit there and he would speak to the people. He would discuss with them, how are your people, how are your family, are they unwell? He would make dua for them, so on and so forth. In this way, one of the greatest achievements of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, as we mentioned, was his compilation of the Quran Kareem. Today when we read the Quran Kareem, all of this sawab, it goes into the Mus'haf, it goes into the Sahifa of Sayyidina Uthman. Because, you know, previous to this, in the time of Sayyidina Abu Bakr Siddiq, we mentioned that the Quran was gathered into one place. But it wasn't a Mus'haf, it wasn't a book. These scrolls were then passed from Sayyidina Abu Bakr to Sayyidina Umar. And Sayyidina Umar passed it to Sayyidina Hafsa bint Umar, his daughter, and the wife of the Prophet ﷺ. Now in the time of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, some problems started to arise. The Khilafah is spreading far and wide into the Persian lands, into various areas, and people are starting to mispronounce certain words of the Quran. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, a lot of dispensations were given. You know, to adjust your tongue, it takes time. Even in our country, you know, in UK we say aluminium, and in America they say aluminum. Now imagine if you had to change your tongue all of a sudden. It's difficult. So they were given dispensation, they were given time. Some of the differences which were present was in some tribes, they never used to use al for the definite particle. For example, rajul means man. And you say ar-rajul means the man. They wouldn't say al, they'd say rajul. Now, to switch all of a sudden is difficult, so they were given leeway that you recite the Quran as you are, and eventually you can come towards the Qurayshi dialect. Another example, alamati mudari, we know it's prayed maftuh, we say ya'lamu. But in some tribes they would pray maqsoor, they say yi'lamu, i'lamu. They would pray like this. So they were given dispensation. They said, look, you read the Quran as you are comfortable for now until you get used to the Qurayshi dialect, because the Quran was revealed in the Qurayshi dialect. But people, after the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they had continued in this way. And Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, when people started fighting amongst the soldiers, and they started arguing, saying that, no, I'm reciting the right way, and you're reciting the wrong way, the people, they approached Sayyidina Uthman, they said, we need to deal with this problem. And so Sayyidina Uthman, he called for the Sahifa, the scroll from Sayyidina Hafsa bint Umar, and he made 7 copies of the Quran al-Kareem. He instructed the companions, and they made 7 copies. And these Qur'ans were then distributed throughout the Khilafah. Where? Madinatul Munawwara, Makkatul Mukarramah, Basra, Kufa, Sham, Yemen and Bahrain. And with each copy of the Quran, Sayyidina Uthman, he sent a reciter to make sure that the people, they reciting the Quran as it was revealed on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now before this, people had their own copies of the Quran. The issue is when you write the Quran whichever way you want to write it, then it can be problems, there can be difficulty. For example, in Surah Fatiha, there's 2 ways of reading the verse Maliki Yawmiddin and Maliki Yawmiddin. Both are correct ways. Both are correct qira'at. But what if you spell it Mim, Alif, Lam, Kaf? How can you read it now? Only one way. You can only read it as Malik. If you write it the way that it was revealed, Mim, Lam and Kaf, you can read it both ways now. You can read it Malik, you can read it Malik. So those individuals had written the Quran according to their own way. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, he had those Qurans removed. He said, either correct your copies or wash off the ink and burn those pages. And then the official copy of the Quran was distributed this way. The scholars, they said, if Sayyidina Uthman had not done this, the way that people had argued about the Bible and the Torah and the Injil, today people would be arguing about the Quran al-Kareem. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised to protect the Quran, to make sure no changes would come to the Quran al-Kareem. And the individual he chose to do this was Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala. Abu Hurairah, when he saw the copies of the Quran al-Kareem, a beautiful hadith, he mentions that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he foretold about the coming of certain individuals who would come. And he said that truly those that love me the most in my ummah are people who shall come after me, believing in me without having seen me, that shall practice what is in the suspended leaves. يَعْمَلُونَ بِمَا فِي الْوَرَقِ الْمُعَلَّقِ. So he said, I thought, what is these suspended leaves? What's the Prophet referring to? These people that love me and they'll practice what's in these suspended leaves. And he says, when Sayyidina Uthman had the copies of the Quran made, then I realized that this is what he was referring to. The Prophet ﷺ had foretold about the compilation of the Quran al-Kareem. And when Sayyidina Uthman, he heard this and he realized he was the one who was gifted this by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He gave a gift of 10,000 to Sayyidina Abu Hurairah radiallahu ta'ala. And Sayyidina Uthman was a very simple person, even as Khalifa, despite the fact that the Khilafah spread far and wide. In the time of Sayyidina Uthman, the Khilafah is spread to the Great Wall of China to the east. In the north, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, all of those areas were conquered. And towards the west, they had gone through North Africa, all the way, and from Tunisia, they had also entered into Andalusia, meaning what's modern day Spain. So all of these areas were conquered and huge wealth was coming to the Muslims. And as we will see, unfortunately though, when the dunya comes to the people, then people, they begin to change, right? Not the companions, but the people who came after. Some of them, unfortunately, they were drowned in this wealth, and the love of wealth and position, they took over them. And so certain fitna and fasad would spread. We conclude, inshaAllah, with the conquest of Cyprus, which is very interesting because the Prophet ﷺ, one day, he used to go to the house of Sayyiduna Ubadah ibn Samit. And his wife was Haram bint Milhan. She was the foster auntie of the Prophet ﷺ. He would go there, he would have some food. One day he had some food, he went to sleep. And Sayyidah Haram, she was tidying the hair of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he woke up and he began to smile. And she said, Ya Rasulullah, why are you smiling? And he said, I saw from my ummah people riding on waves. And it was like that they were on thrones. The Prophet ﷺ was foretelling about these people who would come, and as a consequence of which they would make jihad and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be pleased with them. So Sayyidah Haram, she said, Ya Rasulullah, make dua that I am from those people. And so the Prophet made dua. Now when they would launch from Tunisia into Cyprus, Sayyidina Ubadah bin Samit, he would be part of that army. And who would be with him? His wife. And Sayyidah Haram, as she was in Cyprus, she was riding on one of the animals. Unfortunately, she fell off from this animal and she was martyred. That prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ so many years previously, that she would be part of those individuals who would ride upon those waves, who would perform jihad in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who would attain a high rank. The Prophet ﷺ foretold about this and she was part of them. She was martyred even without lifting a sword. Look at the prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ. In this way, Cyprus came under the control of Muslims. In the time of Sayyidina Umar, the Muslims, they didn't launch any naval attacks because Sayyidina Umar was worried that Muslim lives would be lost on the boats. But Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, when he was approached by Sayyidina Muawiyah for this, Sayyidina Uthman, he said, I agree to do so, but it can't be mandatory upon anyone. Whoever wants to participate, they can participate. And whoever does not want to participate, they will not. Sayyidina Muawiyah radiallahu ta'ala, he was the one who gathered the army. And Sayyidina Abdullah bin Sa'd ibn Abi Sarh, he was also one who came voluntarily. They joined their forces, and this is how Cyprus also came under the control of Muslims in the time of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala an. So this is in regards to Sayyidina Uthman and his Khilafah, a few points which we mentioned. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, even during his Khilafah, he wasn't a person who would act with pomp and pride. He lived a very, very simple existence. They said that, we saw him in the masjid wrapped in a garment, sleeping in the masjid, in the open, like Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala an. And he would feed the food of kings to other people, whilst himself, he would have bread with vinegar and olive oil. And this was his simple existence. He would give food, the most expensive of food, he would feed to other people. Himself, he would eat from very, very simple food. There's one narration, inshallah, we will conclude with this narration. And you look at this. Sayyidina Uthman, he had a servant. One day when he came home, the servant, he was young, so he was playing in the trough of a camel. You know what the camel drinks water out of? He was playing inside. So Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala said to him, what are you doing? And he pinched him at his ear, just to pull him up. And then he realized that, maybe I have done dhulm upon him. Maybe I shouldn't have done this. So this young servant, he says to him, I want you to pull my ear. The young servant says, you Amir al-Mu'mineen, you're the leader of the believers and you're telling me to pull your ear. He goes, no, I can't do this. Sayyidina Uthman says, no, you must do this. Because if I am punished in the hereafter, that is much more severe than me being punished in this world. But the servant, he's young and he gets scared. He says, no, I can't do this. And Sayyidina Uthman takes his hand and he places it and he says, pinch. So he just touches it. No, he says, no, pinch harder. Make sure you do it so that I am given the retribution in this world and I am not punished in the hereafter. You might think that this is something minor, but this is the character of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu. When people tomorrow, we're going to discuss, when they would rebel against him, they would come outside of his house and the armies would be ready to attack these people who are rebelling. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala, he'll refuse. And the reason why he'll refuse is because he's so scared of becoming a dhalim, or becoming an oppressor. Few points in regards to the character of Sayyidina Uthman, inshaAllah ta'ala. We will continue tomorrow after Asr namaz. We make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Oh Allah, forgive us for our major and minor sins. Give us the ability to walk in the footsteps of Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu ta'ala. And we ask, Ya Allah, that in this blessed month of Ramadan, that we worship in abundance and we seek your forgiveness for any shortcoming, any sins. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi jama'een bi rahmatika ya Allah.